Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's very exciting that we have Joe Stiglitz here, and the fullness of the audience is a testament to that. This event is to celebrate or to hear about his new book, which looks really exciting and fascinating, The Road to Freedom, and it's hosted by the program at LSE called Cohesive Capitalism, which is funded by the Open Society. I think everybody knows who Joe Stiglitz is. He's a Nobel Prize winner. He was a member of the US Council of Economic Advisors. He was the senior economist at the World Bank. But actually, the reason this room is so full is because Joe is a very sane, critical and substantial voice in a very mad world. And so I'm really looking forward to hear what he has to say.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. And I'm going to try by the end to have you change the name of your center, the Center for Progressive Capitalism. But you'll understand more by the end. And it's really nice to be back here again, hosting my newest book. I've prepared some slides to hopefully help the discussion. Well, the discussion of freedom and liberty and the relationship to the economic system have moved up front and center in discussions on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's partly because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the freedom of a country has really been put in jeopardy. But what even more motivated my writing the book was what happened during the pandemic, where it was really important for people to be masked and get vaccinated. But the right said, people on the right said, that's taking away my freedom. And as an economist, my reaction was their freedom not to be masked or not to be vaccinated was taking away my freedom to live, or not to be hospitalized, or not to get the disease. In those cases, anybody in any rational country would say the right to live is more important than the right to carry an AK-47. But that same idea then extends to notions like the right to pollute threatens others' right to live a healthy life. And that, there is a trade-off, but again, in society, it has to make judgments. But in each of these cases, I think those are easy. But I want to say that there are a lot of cases that are somewhat more difficult and some that are very difficult. The one I'm going to talk about next is distribution. There are trade-offs in the notion of progressive taxation, redistribution. You're taking money away from somebody and effectively giving it to somebody else. And libertarians claim that they have the right to their income, and taxation is taking away that right. And therefore taxation is a form of coercion, and it is restricting their budget constraints, and therefore their opportunity is set. But at the same time, this redistributive taxation is expanding the opportunity set of others. And what that means, of course, is we have to make judgments. And the judgment is taking money away from Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk will their behavior be significantly affected if they have only 30 billion rather than 300 billion? And the answer, I think, is pretty clear. They would have been as rapacious if they only could get 30 billion as they are getting 300 billion. And that their behavior, for good and for ill, would not be affected significantly. But at the same time, that money could make an enormous difference if it is used productively for investments in education or research or transfers of income to those with low income. But actually, there are externalities that come even from inequality. So the reduction of inequality can make all of society better off. And that was really the thesis of one of my earlier books called The Price of Inequality, that actually, in some cases, policies to redress inequalities can actually make all of society better off. And that leads to the notion that some coercion, like forcing people to pay taxes, can be actually freeing for everybody. And the example that I give that illustrates this, I think, most forcefully is traffic lights. In the absence, traffic lights are a form of coercion. You can't proceed across an intersection until it's green. It's coercing you not to go. And so it's a real restriction on your freedom. But in the absence of the traffic light, you couldn't move anyway. There would be gridlock. And so a simple regulation that says you have to take turns, it's a regulation, but you have to take turns, actually can make everybody, in the end, freer in the way that I've defined it, which is expand their opportunity set because they actually can go across the intersection. So this argument is actually more general. Public goods like basic research, investments in infrastructure, education, and health can expand the opportunity sets for all. The obvious example is, another obvious example is financing the mRNA platform, which was the basis of the very successful vaccines that we had in the United States and around the world, the most effective ones. We might not be here but for that basic research that created that mRNA platform. But if you're going to have that kind of research, you have to fund it. And if you fund it out of taxation, again, economists will say, in the absence of, the problem is what is called the free rider problem. Everybody would like others to contribute, and people free ride on that. And so you have to have the coercion of paying taxes. But that coercion allows all of us to be freer, to live, or to live longer lives than we otherwise would be. So the notion here is that coercion can be freeing. And there are some kinds of coordination where government collective action solves a coordination problem, where coordination can be sustained with very little effort with enormous benefits. And the obvious example is we have to coordinate on what side of the road you drive on. If you visit certain countries, they haven't solved that problem yet. And if you do that, you know what life is like. You're at constant risk. But we've solved that problem. In England and the US, you solve the problem differently. I can't figure out why you solved it in the wrong way. But it works as long as you stay in one of those two places and don't try to drive in the other place. But the point is that actually solving coordination problems actually frees us in very important ways. And that goes to a broader set of context. So that's where exploitation comes in. In practice, and underregulated markets are marked by exploitation. You see it every day in market power, the exploitation in the financial sector of those who are the predatory lending, the abusive credit card practices. Now that constantly, every day there's a new scam, at least in the United States. The latest scam is everybody wants to have solar panels. So there are now a host of predatory providers of solar panels where, working together with Wall Street, they make you a loan to put on the solar panel, only charging you 30% or so. And when you don't make your payment, doubling that. I mean, it's a new form of predatory behavior that Wall Street has found to take advantage of others. And again, there's a trade-off. But again, I think it's a trade-off where we understand how to make that. That is to say, which is more important, the right of corporations to exploit or the right of others not to be exploited. And the exploitation, for instance, of market power by the monopolist constrains consumers' opportunity set. Again, it's broad consensus, but I don't want to say it's universal. My friends in the financial sector don't agree. They think they should be allowed to exploit others, but and that somehow it will trickle down from them down to the rest of society. I think it distorts the economy. And I think they're both moral and efficiency grounds for constraining their behavior. There's a little note here that I mentioned earlier in my introduction, is that there's sometimes non-coercive ways of altering behavior in a pro-social way. One of the these are insights of modern behavioral economics. My next book is going to be on this subject, so I hope I'll come again, where one of the assumptions that has been inflicted on you by your in economics is that preferences are exogenous, determined. You enter life with fixed preferences and unaltered. But of course, none of us really believes that. As parents, we spend an enormous amount of energy trying to make our children nice. And we sometimes fail, but we at least believe that we have some effect on the preferences and what we want our children to be like. And as teachers, that's one of the things that we try to do, not just pour knowledge into your brain. It's really trying to change your views of the world and what you think is right and wrong. So this is very different from the behavioral economics that dominated in the last century with Kahneman and Taylor and Tversky, which was focusing on how we have preferences, but because we have to think fast, we often don't act consistently with those deep preferences. This is a case where actually our social interactions alter our preferences. And there are just 2 points I want to make, which is sometimes we succeed in altering them in a way that make us not as selfish as economists assume. There's a lot of evidence in ultimatum games, dictator games, laboratory experiments, and in other contexts, that people are not quite as selfish as economists assume. There are some who are really selfish, like Donald Trump. Don't get me wrong, and so it's not everybody, but there are that most people, And when we think of ourselves, we don't think of ourselves as nasty as Donald Trump and as selfish, greedy, and so forth. So we don't want to think of ourselves that way, and hopefully we aren't. If we can engender pro-social behavior, we can partially internalize some of the externalities. So we can, you go to Switzerland, people don't litter. And you don't enforce that by a big fine. It's really internalized in their behavior. The second point that I won't have much time to talk about is that the economic and political system actually affects our behavior. And that if you have an economic system that rewards selfishness, greediness, short-termism, you develop people who are greedy, selfish, and short-term. And that's really one of my criticism of neoliberal capitalism, that people like Milton Friedman put on a pedestal. In fact, wrote a paper that CEOs should maximize shareholder value regardless of the effect that it had on environment, exploitation of workers, or taking advantage of consumers. And it was all about maximizing shareholder value. Whatever you could get away with, his view was it was immoral not to do that. And I think that's wrong, and that the economic system has an effect in shaping people in an important way. There are some subtleties here about the distinction between peer pressure and social sanctions as social coercion, but I notice my time is running out, so let me go on and just make one further point, that as we think about shaping views, we have to be aware that the media plays a very important role. They help create, you might say, the meta-narrative, the agenda, how we see the world. And one of my concerns is that disproportionately today, control of the media is in the hands of very rich. And therefore, the messages, the meta-narratives that are being conveyed are distorted. In Britain, at least you have a very strong BBC. It's maybe been underfunded, but and there's a lot of trust. In Sweden, there's similarly a public media. In the United States, we don't have anything comparable. And there's evidence that a strong media actually creates, a public media helps create more trust in society more generally, and it's really important, not just for making sure that the meta-narrative isn't controlled by a few of the people at the very top, but for strengthening trust in society. And trust is really important for the functioning of the economic system. Let me move on to the second part of the analysis of the book, which is what kind of an economic system best delivers on the most freedoms for the most individuals. And here, obviously, I'm trying to compare two systems, a little bit of a caricature, but not really a caricature, of neoliberal capitalism on the one hand, and the system that I'm trying to advocate for, some form of progressive capitalism. And underlying this are a couple of theorems, a couple of basic ideas that part of my own research earlier was that we know that unfettered markets do not lead to efficient outcomes. And it's not just in worlds with externalities of the kind I've talked about, but more fundamentally, whenever there is imperfect information or incomplete markets, which is always, markets are not Pareto efficient. They're not efficient. I've argued that, in other words, that the idea that Adam Smith put forward, but didn't really believe, that the pursuit of interest would lead, as if by an invisible hand, to the well-being of society, that's wrong. The presumption is that unfettered markets do not lead to the well-being of society. And the way I put it succinctly is that the reason that the invisible hand is invisible is that it's not there. And the point is that Milton Friedman's idea that shareholder value maximization would lead to societal welfare, again, is wrong. Interestingly, when at the same time Milton Friedman was pushing this forward, he wrote a famous article in the New York Times Magazine in 1970. I, both alone and working with Sandy Grossman, were writing articles proving that shareholder value maximization did not lead to the well-being of society. But I made a mistake. We made a mistake. We published our papers in the QJE and the Journal of Finance, and he published his paper in the New York Times Magazine. Which do you think got more attention? And he won the public debate. I think we won the intellectual debate. In fact, there was one time I gave a seminar at Chicago, and Milton was there, and he said, "You're wrong." And I said, well, where did I make a mistake in my assumptions or my analysis? He said, "I know you're wrong." And we continued in that vein for a while, and then it was clear it was not making much progress. Similarly, I mentioned before his book, Free to Choose. I said, really, he should have called his book Free to Exploit, because that was really what he was advocating. The Hayek's evolutionary theory was equally flawed, even though it was a little bit more subtle. His claim was that the evolutionary system dynamics would lead to better outcomes, efficient outcomes. But when he was at LSE, he was writing more mathematical articles. As he got older, he got more and more fluffy. And he never proves that result, and obviously the reason is it's not true. We now know that evolution doesn't have any teleology, that I've shown that, in fact, that it's very easy to show that evolutionary processes can lead to very bad outcomes. If we can guide it better, we can get better outcomes. Actually, I argue in the book that neoliberal capitalism may not even be a sustainable institutional arrangement, that, as I say in the last point here on the slide, neoliberal capitalism is a system which may devour itself, and both because you can't sustain competition without strong government, because it is not environmentally sustainable. You pollute, and the whole world is put in jeopardy. The divides it gives rise to make it politically unsustainable. They undermine trust, and without trust, a market economy can't function. You couldn't go to court with every contract in the way that Donald Trump tries to do with every contract that contractor that he engages with. As I said before, it encourages traits which undermine trust and thus undermine economic sustainability. So that comes to the critical questions of what kind of system is better, and what kind of a society is most likely to sustain political freedom and democracy. So here's really the crux of the systemic analysis. Neoliberalism argued that freeing the economy, stripping away regulations, reducing the size of the state, giving full rein to unfettered markets would lead to high growth, trickle-down economics, ensure the benefits would be shared by all. And this hasn't worked out. It's given rise to populism, and populism is giving rise to authoritarianism, and it's setting us on the road to a 21st century form of fascism. So the alternative is my vision of progressive capitalism. Let me first say, some people say putting the word capitalism there is an oxymoron. The two words don't go together. The point I want to make is, in a large society, a large economy, you have to have decentralization. The idea that you could centralize decision-making is just, we know that now that doesn't work. So you have to have decentralization. That means you have to have different units in our society. And using capitalism is only a reminder that among the units that you have in society, there will be some that in a well-organized society that are profit maximizing. That, making steel may make sense to have a profit maximizing firm make steel. But we really ought to be thinking about a richer ecology of institutional arrangements. The government is one part of that, collective action, but there are other forms of collective action. Labor unions are a form of collective action that are very important for workers. Civil society is an important part of collective action to oversee both the public and the private sector. Other form of collective action are class action suits. When somebody gets injured, a single individual may not be able to seek remedy, but a collective action of a class action suit may be. And, moving more towards encouraging forms of that kind of collective action is an important part of what I view as progressive capitalism. But then there are also all sorts of other institutional arrangements, cooperatives. Cooperatives may encourage more cooperative behavior, a little bit less selfishness. And we saw the most successful parts of America's financial system that were demonstrated in the 2008 financial crisis were our financial cooperatives. We call them credit unions. They were the only ones that did not engage in rapacious behavior that marked the other for-profit banks. And after 2008, they were the only ones that continued to provide credit to small businesses. We have actually many cooperatives in the United States, consumer and producer cooperatives. And again, in Europe, there being some very successful cooperatives, Mondragon in Spain being one of the largest in the world. And then there are not-for-profit organizations like Columbia University. And when you think about, one of the real strengths of the United States, it's our universities, our research institutions. None of them are for-profit. The example of the for-profit institution is Trump University. I don't really mean to berate Trump. I think he's a great leader. But those of you may remember Trump University, it had to pay fines in the millions of dollars because it had exploited those who wanted to get ahead and thought they were getting education. And it was a con job, just like everything he does is a con job. So all of our successful universities are either state universities, like University of California and Berkeley and Los Angeles, or not-for-profit institutions like Columbia, Harvard, Princeton, Yale. And these, they're not perfect institutions, but human fallibility, no institution is going to be perfect, but they have actually worked very well and have been the foundations, I think, of a lot of our success as a country. So the first thing I call for in this progressive capitalism is a richer ecology of institutional arrangements. The other thing I call for is greater efficiency and equity with more freedom to choose. As a result of doing a better job at reducing negative externalities through better regulation, more investing in public goods, and correcting a whole variety of other market failures. And this comes back to the fundamental theme: externalities and public goods are especially important in 21st century economies. We have a high level of urbanization. That means that we interact a lot more than you would if you're living in an isolated farm. And we've moved to a knowledge economy. And the basic thing about knowledge is it's a public good. And efficient provision of public goods requires collective action. And so as we've changed our economy, we've become, the benefits of collective action have become even more important. And there are other important collective roles, limiting a variety of forms of exploitation and rent-seeking, providing social protection and social insurance, and a broader view that better risk management enables more risk-taking and, in some circumstances, even more innovation, because undertaking innovation entails risk. Finally, just a word about something I said earlier. The nature of the economic, political, and social system does shape individuals, and I think progressive capitalism, tempering some of the selfishness that has been the hallmark of neoliberal capitalism, would shape individuals in different ways. As I said, it shapes individuals to be greedy, selfish, with limited concerns for others, less empathy, and less honest than we might like. And it's at least possible that cooperatives and other forms of organizational forms may shape individuals to be more cooperative, other regarding, and to enhance social cohesion. And there are a lot of benefits to moving in that direction. Let me, as a next to the last slide, talk about a self-serving argument for why what we do in academia is so important. This is probably an audience I don't have to convince of that, but I want to just emphasize the centrality of liberal education and a democratic media. That education provides a better understanding of the way our preferences are shaped and our actions are affected by others, by peer pressure. And doing this can be, in that sense, fundamentally freeing. In fact, that's one of the purposes of a liberal arts education. So I know a lot of you are concerned about having an education giving you skills to get a job, but what I'm trying to encourage you to do is get an education also to be freer in your thinking about life more generally. And by the same token, I think a more democratic media frees us from having our beliefs shaped by and for the interest of the wealthy. There are some difficult philosophical problems that arise in the context of endogenous preference formation, and I'm not going to be able to solve them today. But I don't want somebody to say, well, you haven't thought about that question. So this is a defensive slide. So let me conclude with greater investments, including in public goods and individuals' capabilities, better management of negative externalities, better social insurance, and stronger social cohesion. Progressive capitalism can enhance individual freedom far more than the kind of unfettered capitalism that Hayek and Friedman advocated, a kind of neoliberalism that has predominated for the last 4 decades. And in that sense, that links to the subtitle, Economics in the Good Society. I think that kind of progressive capitalism can do a better job of creating a good society and setting us more firmly on the road to freedom than neoliberalism, which has been setting us on the road, I think, towards authoritarianism. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. That was brilliant. And I love your social ecology. And I say social ecology because I was trying to think, is progressive capitalism really the term you want? Why stick to capitalism? You're not talking about socialism, at least not socialism as state-controlled, but maybe something like the civil economy or the social economy. I mean, capitalism implies the market is still the predominant mechanism in society.
Yeah. Well, let me say first, it was partly because I'm trying to sell these ideas to an American audience. So so I don't want to undermine the sense of pandering. But that having been said, I do think that it still will be the case that profit-making institutions will play an important role. Regulated, taxed properly, but they're still an important part of our institutional structure. And I also use words to describe it as a rejuvenated social democracy. And the reason I use the word rejuvenated is that some places where there's been social democracy, it's really been weakened in the last 30 years with the predominance of neoliberal ideas. So some of the places that we used to think as the bastion of social democracy, it's really been weakened in the way that I would at least like to see it.
No, not to mention this country. Gosh, we could.
And can I say one thing? What I like about the term social democracy, as opposed to the emphasis of progressive capitalism, it does emphasize the role that democratic processes have to play in making sure that our society functions for the benefit of most people.
Yeah, I agree. But anyway, we should have some questions from the audience. Somebody, and I don't know who, is collecting the questions online. Sharon, okay. But I'm first going to take some questions here. So, yes, this will be the first, because you're the first person I've seen.
I'm trying to get the microphone to work. Well, actually, we're going to have very limited time, so maybe I got the question, and it's a standard question. Let me, which is that we all, the government often is inefficient, ineffective, and anybody who's lived through the Trump administration knows that government can fail, or even through the last Bush administration. All human institutions are fallible. We're all fallible. So the question since the Enlightenment has been, how do we structure society to ensure that it does what we want it to do, including democratic governments. Now, when we talk about waste, no government is I shouldn't say no government, few governments have wasted money on the scale of what happened in the 2008 financial crisis, the lead up to it and afterwards. Massive misallocation of resources in the capital market. The result of that was massive underutilization of resources, costing us trillions of dollars. So let's make clear that the private sector can be very, very inefficient. And, as we sort of glorify the private sector, we should remember, and I'll talk a little bit from the point of view of the United States, the inefficiency of our private healthcare system, of our private, of our telephone systems. Every day is a battle with the internet companies. Our banks are out there to exploit us, and we see it. Food companies are exploiting people so that we have an episode of epidemic of childhood diabetes. We have an opioid crisis. The pharmaceutical pushed opioids on our country. And the cost to our country of that is lives. Lifespan has declined, and so we should be clear that there are lots of imperfections on all sides around, and the main failure, I think, of government is not stopping the private sector from engaging in these totally destructive activities. That's the main failure. Now, the successes of government, where would we be without government investment that led to the internet? Especially in COVID-19. It even invented the first browser. And then it gave us the mRNA platform that allowed us to have an effective vaccine. So, yes, government fails. Trump illustrates. But government succeeds a lot, and the private sector fails, and the private sector succeeds a lot. And so our goal shouldn't be to demonize one or the other, but to try to say, how can we use the strengths of each of them, and how can we use, and one of the things I emphasize is, how can we use systems of checks and balances, not only within government, but within our overall society, to prevent the abuses that can occur in either of the two sectors.
Okay, I've got Robert Wade here.
What is your assessment of the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act in the context of your analysis of progressive capitalism?
That's a great question. And Robert did some very important research on industrial policies in Taiwan, wasn't it? They worked there. And then in the era of neoliberalism, industrial policies were a no-no. Or more accurately, the United States and Europe used the WTO to circumscribe the ability of developing countries and emerging markets to use industrial policies, while we continue to use industrial policies in the United States in our Defense Department. And that's where we got the internet, and then we use public health as another source of industrial policy, but everybody believes it's good to have better drugs against disease. And we've now brought back industrial policy in the United States, interestingly, in a bipartisan way. And so even Republicans have now abandoned the extremes of neoliberalism and have said you need a government, partly in response to the strong evidence of the lack of resilience of the private sector that became so evident in COVID-19. You know, they had supply chains that were just not resilient. You know, the just-in-time inventory system made our whole economy very fragile. It was very good when there were no disturbances, but it was not robust against disturbances. So I welcome this kind of rebirth of resurgence of industrial policy. Those particular industrial policies were not optimally designed, partly because we hadn't had really the experience that East Asia, we hadn't learned the lesson from East Asia of how to design good industrial policies. I think they did a better job in designing theirs in Korea, Japan, and Taiwan than we have. And there's now a lot of work, I'm engaged in some of this, of how we can reform those industrial policies to make them better, and better in the sense of better outcomes per dollar, more equitable, less capture, insulate them against capture. So overall, though, they are really important. And just the IRA is called an Inflation Reduction Act. It really wasn't much about inflation. Its main objective was to move the United States along in the trajectory of a green transition when we had resisted doing that. And the CHIPS Act was to restore the ability of the U.S. to make chips and less dependence on Taiwan.
Great. Now I'm going to ask Sharon to read out 2 questions, and then I'm going to take the lady at the back on my principle of taking women, but too many men have put their hands up.
Hello. Hello. Okay, I have a question. Sorry.
Can you hear her?
What is your economic perspective about the impact of the current conflicts around the world?
Ask 2 questions.
What was the first question? I didn't hear it.
What is the economic impact of current
what's your perspective on the current conflicts around the world?
Okay. And what is your proposal for the policy change we can make to discourage pursuit of shareholder value at all costs? Will tax reform do the trick?
I didn't get it.
Can you say it a bit louder?
Oh, sorry. What is your proposal for what policy change we can make to discourage pursuit of shareholder value at all costs? Will tax reform do the trick?
Can tax reform reduce the pursuit of shareholder value?
Oh, well, yeah. Okay, first, on the first question, conflicts are bad. I think you mean, wars and what's going on in the Middle East and Ukraine. are bad for the people who are affected, but they're also bad for the global economy. You know, in the Middle East, there's still a risk of what happened in the 70s with conflict, where oil prices went way up. We've just been through a very bad episode of energy prices going up, and it's been really hard, especially for Europe, but for the global economy. The way we produce food today is very dependent on fertilizer, and that's very dependent on a supply of energy, and so it's not just direct energy, our energy system, but it's also our food supply system. So conflicts create a lot of risk, and when those risks get materialized, they can have disastrous effects on the global economy. In the aftermath of the sharp rise in oil prices in the 70s, was a lost decade in Latin America. It's just one example of the global repercussions. So, but the most, obviously, the greatest effect are still on the people in the conflict areas. On the issue of shareholder value maximization, taxes are not enough. You need multiple changes in our legal framework. One example is corporate governance laws. In many countries, corporate governance laws say that that's what firms are supposed to do. They were influenced by Milton Friedman, unfortunately. And many places have corporate governance laws that say, if your CEO doesn't do that, he's not doing what the company doesn't do that. He's not fulfilling the obligation, and he can be sued for not maximizing shareholder value. The other countries, other states, jurisdictions in the United States, corporate governance laws in the United States are largely the responsibility of the individual states. Say that you should have broader stakeholder value, stakeholder capitalism, where you take into account not only the shareholders, the balancing act, but of the workers, the communities, the customers, and the environment. So you take a broader perspective. We have the peculiar situation in the United States. If you're a pension fund, you are not a union pension fund. Is obligated in almost everywhere in the United States to look only at the economic returns they get out of their investments. And so they aren't allowed to even think about whether the companies in which they are investing their money are engaged in bad labor practices, like Amazon. They say, well, as a union pension fund, you're just concerned with maximizing the returns on your investments, not with the environment, not with how their labor practices. And I think that's wrong. And it turns out that taking a broader view can often, over the longer run, get just as high or even higher returns. So those are examples of changes in our legal structure that would facilitate a move away from shareholder value maximization.
Great. Now I'm going to take two questions from the floor, and I'm taking that lady there and this lady here in a blue cardigan.
So
yeah.
governments, of course, work at the country level. The most rapacious corporations are very much global. So what steps would you recommend, and especially in the current very challenging international context, to ensure that these very needed checks and balances can also be applied at the global level to avoid companies jumping around between different jurisdictions, and so that the checks and balances can really work by means of a global governance?
Hold that question. Can you remember it?
Yeah.
Because somebody was talking to me, and now the lady in blue. I think you need a mic.
Thank you. In relation to progressive capitalism, what's the role of AI in it? And do you see it as potentially hindering freedom, or vice versa?
Well, let me say, the way the AI interacts with freedom in a broad sense is that AI has the potential, and I would say likely, and I've written a little bit about this, likely to have large distributive effects unless we respond appropriately. And when we respond appropriately, what I mean is both steer the innovation, the nature of the innovation, and to the extent that we don't succeed in steering it the right way, at least engage in redistributive actions that make sure that the benefits don't all go to a few people and are widely shared. And an important ingredient in this overall policy, it will entail adapting our competition laws. The question, there's a significant risk of further agglomeration of market power because they work more powerfully when they have more data, and there will be some enterprises that will have larger data sets, and really, at least there's a potential where they're dominating that market. There's a lot of uncertainty about the evolution of AI, even among the people in Silicon Valley and those engaged in AI. The concern, of course, is that AI will be what we call labor replacing. And therefore decrease the demand for labor, particularly not only unskilled labor, which is what robots have done, but even skilled labor. That there are fields like they can write a good. Do good journalism, not great journalism, but they can do journalism. For my 80th birthday, one of my students, former students, trained AI on my data. And the question was, could I be replaced? And I asked it 10 questions, and on the first 5, which were, the kind of questions I get asked all the time about, the effect of interest rates or something like that, it did as well as I could have done, and much faster. It just spews out the answer. But on the last 3 that were more difficult, where it hadn't really read my 1973 article as closely as it should have, probably because it's wasn't fed to it. It was going back too far. It was a disaster. It got exactly the wrong answer, 180 degrees wrong. So I have a few more years before I'm going to be replaced. But that's one aspect of AI. It replaces labor, it reduces the demand. The other aspect is the point I just made. It can enhance our productivity. And I sometimes call that IA, intelligence assisting, rather than AI. So it's like a microscope, a telescope. It enhances our own innate abilities. And there are people working on aspects of AI that will, that actually, like EdTech, trying to improve the quality of education by, saying, having working question where they adapt more quickly to where you give a wrong answer and where you give a right answer. So there are things that they can do to enhance our ability. I think overall, though, I do worry about it increasing inequality, and we will have to respond. On the question of the regulation of multinationals, that's really, it's a good question, and some of the multinationals are bigger than small countries, and that makes it more difficult. The particular aspect of that I've been involved in is how do we, in our globalized world, make these multinationals pay their fair share of taxes. Companies like Apple and Google may have produced goods that are, that we like a lot. Apple making the corners of their telephone round rather than square is really given a lot of people a lot of enjoyment. And I don't know if you know about, there was a big intellectual property dispute over that particular question. But they may, I don't want to minimize what they've done, but they've been even smarter about avoiding taxes. And globalization has given them a framework in which they can do that, with the secrecy havens, Cayman Islands, and, why are so many companies located in Cayman Islands? Is the weather really particularly good for engaging in financial transactions? Or is there something else going on called secrecy and tax evasion? And I think or regulatory evasion. We all know the answer. It is not because the Cayman Islands are a particularly good place to do financial transactions, other than tax evasion and regulatory avoidance. So there's been a big global campaign to make them pay their fair share of taxes. But it was originally put in the hands of the OECD, which is the think tank of the advanced countries. And the advanced countries were, and this is a case of capture, were captured by, particularly in the United States, by Apple and Google and the digital giants. And what came out eventually out of a long process lasting over 10 years was something good, a requirement of a minimum tax, but it was set at 15%, and then they have carve-outs to bring the rate down to 12 or 13%, which is less than half of the tax rate in Latin America, for instance. So having minimum is better than zero, but it really wasn't up to the task. So now there is a big initiative at the UN to frame a better, to create a better framework for requiring them to pay their fair share of taxes. In terms of regulating bad behavior, in one way or another, Europe and the United States have a special responsibility. And there is, for instance, again, in the area of digital, the digital giants, there's something that's now called the Brussels effect, that regulation of the digital giants through the Digital Marketing Act, DMA, the Digital Service Act, which tries to restrict some of the digital harms created by these digital giants, is having a global effect. It's not strong enough, but when Europe and the United States act strongly, they have global effects. And so, yes, you know, a small country isn't going to be able to fully regulate, but they can say, you know, South Africa can say, if you don't play by our rules, you can't come in. And there are enough good South African entrepreneurs and sufficient global competition that if one of the American companies, like Google, doesn't behave well, the void can be filled. There's other search engines that can enter. So I don't think even small countries should resign and just say, oh, you know, we're victims. I think they can take a stronger actions.
Great. Now I'm going to go back to the online, and you're going to give me another 2 questions.
Okay, so can you comment on the value of social religious institutions in lower income countries versus high income countries? For example, in Nepal, social institutions such as religious taboos are used to limit people from cutting down trees in local forests.
I didn't, neither of us could hear that.
Did you hear the beginning?
No.
No, we didn't hear anything of it.
Oh, sorry. I have to really shout, sorry. Can you comment on the value of social religious institutions in lower income countries versus higher income countries? For example, in Nepal, social institutions such as religious taboos are used to limit people from cutting down trees in local forests.
I think, if I understand the question, is, yeah, I mean, this is part of the general view that I have, that a successful society ought to have a broad array of institutions. And I was going to comment earlier that this is increasingly important because we're moving to a care economy where a large fraction of the population, a large fraction of GDP, we've moved from manufacturing to a service sector economy, and an important part of the service sector economy is caring for, you know, education, healthcare, caring for the elderly, and many of those people, there are large asymmetries of information, and many of the people are not able to make really informed decisions about whether they're getting adequate care. Somebody with dementia can't judge whether they're being taken advantage of. And in that context, religious institutions, nonprofits of a variety of kind can play a very important role. You know, more broadly, thinking about the infinite future generations, churches have played an important role in protecting the environment, thinking about the next generation. And Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment, climate change, and social justice has had, in many parts of the world, a lot of influence. So that's an example of how a broad array of institutions that we ought to embrace as we think about what makes for a good society.
Now, it's actually 8 o'clock, but we started 5 minutes late, and there's somebody, and we haven't taken anyone from the top floor, and there's somebody at the back there in a white jacket who's been trying to catch my eye the entire time. So I'm going to let him ask the last question.
Hello. Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. Thank you, Professor Kaldor. Thank you, LSE. My question is, how we can apply this knowledge, the workers, the local people, we as a student, the people that don't know about economics, This we talk about Friedman, inclusive growth, the war, freedom. How we can apply this amazing knowledge? Thank you so much.
Well, there are two parts of the answer to that question. One is how this affects our behavior as individuals. Let me tell a little story. For a long time, I've gone to Davos, and at Davos, which is where all the muckety-mucks get together to talk to each other, I for a long time had sessions with some corporate leaders, some important ones, about corporate social responsibility. Sometimes about the environment, sometimes about broader issues of social justice. And many of the people who, in the sessions I go to, are seemingly very conscientious. And we have discussions about inequality and talk about the data about how bad things are getting, and they express concern about inequality and how bad it is. And then one year, one of the CEOs, a very nice guy who was a leader of a major American company, said in our discussion we were having, I just discovered that 40% of my labor force was paid less than a living wage, which of course was what we've been talking about for the last 5 or 10 years. But he thought about it in a very abstract term, about inequality as a concept. And suddenly it dawned on him that it was actually something that he was a player. This was a game in which he had a lot of agency and being able to change. And so he said, after he discovered it, he raised all his workers' wages to a livable wage. It cost his shareholders a little bit, but it made him feel a lot better. And I think in the long run, it was probably good for the company. And the fact that the workers in the company felt that they were actually not part of the problem, but part of the solution. So there are so many aspects of our individual behavior that affect all the things that I've talked about that we ought to think about as we go about our day-to-day life. But, this book is really written much more, as you may have figured out by now, with a political objective in mind. That it is really through political action that we're going to change the way our economic system works. We have to change the regulations, the tax structures, expenditures, the rules that govern us, that govern the economy. So this is really a call for political action, and try to engage governments to move in this direction. My own view is very strongly, I hope it came across, that small tweaks to the system aren't going to be enough. That the deficiencies in our economic system are too grave to be remedied by a little bit more education here, or a little bit more regulation there. Somebody might say, well, why, don't we need a revolution? And I have a little discussion of that in the book. the answer might be, yes, we do need a revolution, but the history of revolutions is not very good. And there's a good reason for that, because revolutions tear the fabric of society, and society, if it's going to function, there has to be trust and there has to be a kind of cohesiveness, and that's where the term of your term of cohesive or capitalism is a good term. So there has to be a certain kind of social cohesion if we're going to get societal change. And so, what I'm really calling for is the most radical change, reforms that we can get out of our political system, and without a revolution, and that we can get peacefully, because conflict, I think, is destructive. So really, I've tried to lay out an agenda for that kind of rapid change in our society.
Well, thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. Now, before you start clapping, I just want to make an announcement, and then you're allowed to clap as long as you like, which is that there are signed books you can buy outside, but if you want Joe to sign your copy of your book, you have to queue up here, and just for 15 minutes on this side. So you can do that after you've clapped, but now you're allowed to clap.